No one realized at first that Caddy Blauvelt was missing. It started subtly, an unanswered message, a missed appointment, a delay that felt inconvenient but not alarming. After all, people got busy, phones died, life had its unpredictable moments. But as the hours stretched, concern turned into quiet unease, and soon that unease grew into full-blown panic. Kadi was a creature of habit. She worked at a small pet store in town, a job she loved because it let her spend time around animals. On any given day, she would clock out around the same time, drive straight home, and maybe stop by a cafe if she had time. She wasn't someone who vanished without explanation. The evening she disappeared, the streets of Simpsonville were calm, undisturbed. The small-town quiet that locals found comforting now seemed oppressive. Lights flickered in neat suburban homes, families settled in for the night, and the world carried on, unaware that somewhere in the darkness, something had gone terribly wrong. Her car was still parked in its usual spot, just outside her apartment. The front door was locked. Inside, her things were exactly where they should be, her purse by the couch, her keys on the counter. But she wasn't there. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. Her phone, abandoned on the nightstand, was the first sign that something wasn't right. Kadi was never without her phone. She texted, she scrolled, she checked in. Yet there it was, its screen dark, lifeless, while worried friends and family flooded it with calls. At first, those closest to her tried to be rational. Maybe she had stepped out. Maybe she had met someone and lost track of time. But the more they thought about it, the less sense it made. If she had gone out voluntarily, wouldn't she have taken her car, her phone? Wouldn't she have told someone? Hours passed, then a full day. When the police were finally called, the responding officers did what they always did in cases like these. They asked about her habits, her relationships, her recent moods. They checked for signs of forced entry. They canvassed the area. And as was routine, they asked whether Kati might have simply left on her own. But there was no indication that she had. She had been scheduled to meet friends after work, plans she had been looking forward to. She had not packed any bags, withdrawn any money, or left a note. There were no signs of distress in her apartment, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest she had struggled. And yet she was gone. As word spread, fear took hold. Friends shared her photo online, pleading for any information. Strangers began asking questions. The town, once indifferent, now felt the weight of something sinister creeping beneath its surface. Because people didn't just vanish in Simpsonville. Something had happened to Kati Blauvelt. And the question wasn't just where she was, it was who had taken her. It was 2 days before anyone found her. At first, no one connected the discovery of a body to Kati's disappearance. It was a cold October evening when a local teenager, looking for a place to hang out with friends, wandered into an abandoned house on the outskirts of Simpsonville. The house had stood empty for years, its walls covered in graffiti, its windows broken from neglect. Kids sometimes dared each other to go inside, but most avoided it. Something about the house felt wrong. The boy never made it past the first floor. The smell hit him first. A deep, sour stench, thick in the air, something that didn't belong in a place forgotten by time. At first, he thought it was a dead animal. But then, as his flashlight swept across the wooden floor, he saw the stairs leading down. The door to the basement was slightly ajar, a shadowy gap between rusted hinges. He didn't want to look, but something compelled him to step forward, his sneakers pressing into dust that had settled for years. The beam of his flashlight trembled as he aimed it downward. That was when he saw her. A scream shattered the stillness, echoing off the empty walls. The boy didn't stop running until he was halfway down the street, his breath ragged, hands shaking as he dialed 911. The responding officers didn't need long to confirm what they were dealing with. The crime scene was secured, yellow tape sealing off the house from the growing crowd of curious onlookers. The media hadn't arrived yet, but whispers spread through the town like wildfire. Someone had been killed, and whoever had done it had left them there, alone in the dark, waiting to be found. The basement was almost empty, save for the dust-covered remnants of old furniture, collapsed wooden beams, and discarded trash. In the farthest corner, where the walls met at a sharp angle, lay the body. She had been left in a way that suggested she had not simply fallen there. Her arms were positioned unnaturally, her head turned slightly to the side, dark blonde hair matted to her skin. Blood had dried beneath her, seeping into the concrete. The walls around her were bare, except for a single scuff mark near the floor, a detail only the forensic team would later find important. She had been stabbed multiple times. There were no signs of a struggle in the basement. No overturned objects, no broken nails, no evidence that she had fought back. That meant one of two things. She had either been unconscious when she was brought here, or she had been killed elsewhere and moved afterward. By the time the coroner arrived, the officers already suspected the latter. Her body was still intact, showing no signs of prolonged exposure to the elements, meaning she had not been in the basement long. The wounds were precise, deliberate. There was no sign of a weapon. The killer had taken it with them, leaving behind only the body and the silence. The first real clue was the shoes. Kati Blauvelt was still wearing them. White sneakers, slightly dirty but relatively clean. Not the kind of shoes someone would willingly wear into an abandoned house. There was no reason for her to be there. No connection between her and the property. She hadn't come to this house on her own. Someone had brought her here. As the forensic team worked, officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious. Most had nothing useful to offer. Some mentioned that the house had been empty for years. Others admitted they had heard noises at odd hours, but assumed it was just teenagers trespassing. Only one person recalled seeing something strange. A woman living down the street told detectives that on the night Kati went missing, she had seen a car parked outside the house. She couldn't describe the make or model, only that it had been dark-colored and idling for some time before driving off. It wasn't much, but it was something. By the time Kati's identification was confirmed, the news had already begun to spread. The missing woman wasn't missing anymore. The town, already shaken, now found itself holding its breath, waiting for answers. The police weren't ready to call it murder just yet, not officially, but the people of Simpsonville weren't stupid. Kati Blauvelt had been found. Now the real question was, who had left her there? The town of Simpsonville was still in shock. Crime like this didn't happen here. People locked their doors at night, but mostly out of habit, not fear. Neighbors knew each other by name. Strangers nodded in passing. It was the kind of place where people left their cars unlocked in the driveway, confident that nothing bad would come of it. But all of that changed with Kati Blauvelt's murder. Her body had been found in an abandoned house, discarded like an afterthought. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime that rattled the town. It was the sheer mystery of it. How did a young woman with no known enemies end up stabbed to death in a place she had no reason to be? Why had no one seen anything? And most chilling of all, who had wanted her dead? The Simpsonville Police Department wasted no time launching a full-scale investigation. The lead detective, Mark Hastings, was an experienced officer who had worked homicide cases in larger cities before transferring to Simpsonville years ago. But even in his long career, something about this case felt off. He had seen violent crimes, bar fights turned deadly, gang disputes, crimes of passion. But this was different. This wasn't just violence. It was planned. He could feel it in the details. The abandoned house, the lack of a struggle, the deliberate placement of the body. These weren't the actions of someone who had lost control in the heat of the moment. Whoever had done this had made calculated decisions, and that meant they could do it again. Detectives started with the basics. Who had last seen Kati? Where had she been before she disappeared? What kind of life had she been living in the days leading up to her murder? They quickly compiled a timeline of her last known movements. Kati had worked a normal shift at the pet store the day she vanished. Surveillance footage showed her leaving around 2:15 p.m., stepping out into the late afternoon sun, carrying her purse over one shoulder. She had exchanged friendly goodbyes with coworkers. Nothing seemed unusual. Her next stop was supposed to be a local coffee shop, where she had plans to meet a friend. But she never showed up. Instead, she disappeared. Her car was found outside her apartment, parked in its usual spot. Her phone was inside, along with her purse and wallet. The front door was locked. Nothing looked disturbed. It was as if she had just stepped out for a moment, except she never came back. One man who lived directly across the street mentioned something strange. Sometime after Caddy had arrived home, he had noticed a dark-colored car idling outside her apartment. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Maybe a delivery driver, maybe a friend picking her up. But now, with everything that had happened, the memory gnawed at him. How long had the car been there? He couldn't say exactly. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe more. Had he seen who was inside? Number the windows had been tinted and it was getting dark. Had he heard anything? No. No raised voices, no sounds of a struggle. Just silence. It wasn't much, but it was something. Meanwhile, detectives looked deeper into Caddy's personal life. Friends described her as kind, outgoing, and independent. She didn't have enemies. She wasn't involved in anything shady. But when they asked whether she had any problems, whether anyone had made her feel unsafe, several of them hesitated. Then one of them admitted something chilling. Caddy had been scared in the weeks leading up to her death. She had mentioned feeling like she was being watched. Sometimes she thought she saw the same car following her. Other times she swore someone had been near her apartment at odd hours, but she had convinced herself it was paranoia. She never said exactly who she was afraid of, but she had hinted at someone from her past. Detectives pulled her phone records, searching for anything unusual. There were no threatening messages, no disturbing calls. But one text stood out, sent just hours before she disappeared. It was to a close friend, and it read, "If anything happens to me, tell them to look at him." The problem was she never said who him was. Detective Hastings felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Whoever him was, he had been on her mind that day. Detectives turned their attention to Caddy's ex-husband, John Blauvelt. Divorces could be messy, and hers had been no exception. There had been fights. There had been calls to the police. And most importantly, there had been a restraining order. She had feared him once. Had that fear ever truly gone away? They checked John's records. He was a former Army recruiter, but his discharge from service was murky. He had a history of volatile behavior, though nothing serious enough to result in charges. But what concerned detectives the most was his location, because when they went to speak with him, they discovered something disturbing. John Blauvelt was no longer in town. John Blauvelt was gone. The moment detectives attempted to track him down for questioning, they hit a wall. There was no sign of him at his last known address. His phone number had been disconnected. No recent employment records. It was as if he had simply vanished, which to an investigator meant one thing. He was running. The sense of urgency within the task force grew sharper. People disappeared all the time for all sorts of reasons, but someone with a connection to a murder victim, someone with a documented history of violence, someone whose estranged wife had been brutally stabbed to death, that was not someone detectives could afford to lose track of. They dug into everything: his military record, his past relationships, his finances. Every detail of his life was now under scrutiny, and the deeper they went, the more unsettling things became. John's military service was the first red flag. He had been an Army recruiter, which meant he was trained in discipline, structure, and perhaps more importantly, how to disappear if he needed to. There were gaps in his file, inconsistencies in his discharge history that the Army wasn't eager to elaborate on. Hastings knew how that worked. Sometimes the military didn't want its problems made public, but that raised another concern. Had John been discharged because of his behavior? Had there been prior incidents of violence? If so, the police had no immediate way of knowing, because the Army wasn't sharing. They turned their attention to Caddy's restraining order. It was from a little over a year ago. The official complaint stated that she had feared for her safety. She had called the police on multiple occasions, reporting harassment, unwanted contact, and once even being followed home. Nothing had ever led to an arrest, but it painted a terrifying picture. Caddy had been afraid of him long before she died. That fear had been valid. Now she was dead, and John was gone. Detectives knew this was no coincidence. The search for him intensified. Hastings requested a nationwide BOLO, be on the lookout for John Blauvelt. His photo and description were distributed to law enforcement agencies across multiple states. Then they checked his finances. If John was on the run, he would need money, and money always left a trail. His bank accounts were checked. No withdrawals, no recent transactions, nothing that indicated normal activity. That was concerning. Most fugitives made mistakes early on. They used a card at a gas station, pulled cash from an ATM, checked into a motel under a real name. John had done none of that. Had he planned this escape before Caddy was even found? Or worse, before she was even killed? Hastings and his team began reconstructing a timeline for John's last known whereabouts. He had been in Simpsonville just days before the murder. There were records of him at his usual haunts, grocery stores, his apartment complex, places he frequented. But then, immediately after Caddy was found, he disappeared completely, and he hadn't gone alone. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected place, a missing persons report filed in another county. A 17-year-old girl, Hannah Thompson, had been reported missing around the same time John vanished. She wasn't just any girl. She had been seen with John days before his disappearance. Detectives now had an entirely new problem. If John Blauvelt had run, he hadn't run alone. He had taken a teenager with him. The case had just escalated. What had started as a murder investigation was now a manhunt. John Blauvelt had disappeared, and he wasn't alone. By the time police confirmed his absence, the case had already shifted from a local homicide investigation to a multi-state manhunt. This wasn't just about tracking a murder suspect anymore. It was about finding a missing teenager, Hannah Thompson, before something worse happened. Detectives didn't know yet whether Hannah had left willingly or if she had been coerced. Either way, the situation was critical. A man with a violent past had vanished into the unknown with a 17-year-old girl, and there was no telling what might happen next. Hastings and his team alerted the FBI. With a minor involved, the case immediately escalated to federal interest. The National Crime Information Center, NCIC, flagged John as a fugitive suspect and Hannah as an endangered missing person. Now every law enforcement agency in the country was watching. John had done a good job covering his tracks. His bank accounts were untouched. His phone was off. There were no rental car records, no hotel stays in his name. If he had planned this, he had done so meticulously, like someone who had been thinking about running long before Caddy's body was ever found. Detectives focused on where he might go. Where did he have friends, family, connections from the military? They combed through his past addresses, searching for any pattern. Then the first lead surfaced. A security camera at a gas station in Georgia had picked up a man resembling John at a pump. Less than 48 hours after he disappeared. He was wearing a baseball cap, keeping his head low. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m., the kind of hour when most people were asleep. He wasn't alone. A girl was in the passenger seat. The footage was grainy, the angle wasn't perfect, but everything pointed to the same conclusion. Hannah was with him. The car wasn't registered in his name. It had temporary plates, ones that were difficult to track. But this was proof. John was on the move. The FBI expanded the search radius. State patrol units across Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida were notified to be on high alert. Flyers with Hannah's face were distributed across rest stops, bus stations, truck stops, places where fugitives on the run might pass through. But days passed. Nothing. The frustration among investigators grew. The longer John stayed ahead of them, the more dangerous the situation became. There were too many unknowns. Was Hannah being held against her will, or had she chosen to go with him? Detectives dug deeper into their relationship. John had met Hannah months before Caddy's murder. They had become close, though the full extent of their relationship was unclear. Some of Hannah's friends suspected there was more between them than just a friendship. But even if that was the case, why would she leave everything behind to go on the run with him? Was she afraid of him? Or had he manipulated her into believing they needed to run? Detectives interviewed Hannah's family. Her parents were devastated. They didn't believe for a second that she had left willingly. She was a high school senior, about to graduate. She had a life, friends, dreams. None of this made sense. But sometimes people didn't run because they wanted to. They ran because they were scared. One thing was certain. John had a plan. He was moving carefully. He was making sure not to leave a trail. He knew how law enforcement operated. He was trained for this. And that meant he wasn't going to be easy to catch. Another week passed, nothing. Then an unexpected twist. A tip came in from Alabama. A woman working the late shift at a motel off the interstate called police after seeing a girl who looked like Hannah checking in with an older man. She wasn't sure, but something felt off about the situation. By the time officers arrived, the room was empty. The bed was unmade. The shower was still damp. They had just missed them, but now they knew. John was still on the move, and he was getting closer to disappearing for good. John Blauvelt had become a ghost. Despite the full force of law enforcement tracking his every potential move, he remained one step ahead, slipping through their fingers like smoke. There had been glimpses, security footage, fleeting witness accounts, but each time he and Hannah vanished before authorities could close in. This wasn't luck. This was skill. John knew how to disappear. He had military training. He understood surveillance, tracking methods, and the blind spots of law enforcement. He knew what mistakes most fugitives made, and he wasn't making them. No digital footprint, no ATM withdrawals, no calls or texts that could be traced. Every move he made was deliberate. Every stop was temporary. For weeks, he left behind nothing but the faintest hints. A gas station camera catching a blurred profile, a motel clerk remembering his face but not his name, a waitress recalling a quiet man with a teenage girl who never spoke much. But none of it was enough. Each sighting proved only one thing. They were still moving. And then, finally, he slipped up. It wasn't a major mistake, just a small one. But sometimes that was all it took. Investigators had been focusing on motel records, truck stops, and transient areas, anywhere that someone on the run, without a home base, might stay for a night or two before moving on. They had put out bulletins warning motel owners to watch for guests paying in cash, avoiding cameras or checking in late at night. And then in a small town in Texas, a motel clerk recognized his face. John had checked in under a fake name. He paid in cash, stayed one night, and checked out early in the morning. But something about him unsettled the woman at the front desk. Maybe it was the way he avoided eye contact. Maybe it was how the girl with him never spoke. Whatever it was, it stuck with her. And when she saw his photo on the news 2 days later, she knew. She immediately called the FBI. The room he had stayed in was already cleaned, but investigators still searched for anything he might have left behind. They dusted for prints, checked security footage, and searched nearby stores, gas stations, anywhere he might have gone. And then they found something critical. A store clerk at a convenience shop down the road remembered him. The man had come in late at night. He bought food, drinks, and prepaid cell phones. That was it. The detail was small, but the prepaid phones changed everything. Most fugitives avoided using their own phones because they could be traced, but prepaid burner phones were different. They were anonymous, hard to track, unless they made one crucial mistake. If John used one of those phones to contact anyone from his past, it could give police an exact location. And that was what investigators were now betting on. They worked fast. The FBI cyber unit scanned for new unregistered phone numbers popping up in areas where John had been sighted. They looked for calls or texts made to people connected to him, family, old friends, anyone he might have trusted. Then they found it, a single outgoing text message sent from a brand new phone. The message was simple: need help. It had been sent to a former Army buddy of John's, a man now living in California. And that meant John was headed west. This was the first real breakthrough they had in weeks. Detectives now had a direction, a target, a possible destination. The chase wasn't just about following where John had been anymore. Now, for the first time, they could predict where he was going next, and they would be waiting. John Blauvelt had been running for weeks. Every day that passed without his capture only made him bolder. He had eluded law enforcement at every turn, staying ahead of their efforts, cutting off any trail before it could fully form. He had played the role of a ghost well, never leaving digital footprints, never staying in one place too long, never making the kind of mistake that would allow authorities to close in, until now. The text message to his former Army acquaintance had been a miscalculation. It wasn't just the content of the message. Need help. It was the fact that he had sent it at all. The FBI's cyber division had immediately flagged the number, tracing it back to the prepaid phone John had purchased at a gas station in Texas. From there, They ran its usage data through a geolocation algorithm, cross-referencing cell tower pings, looking for patterns in movement. Within hours, they had an answer. The phone had last pinged near a highway rest stop on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona. He was heading west, just as they had suspected. Now they had something to work with. Authorities began focusing their search along the westbound highway routes leading toward California. Every motel, truck stop, and gas station along the way was monitored. Any new burner phones purchased in the area were immediately flagged for surveillance. But John wasn't an amateur. By the time the FBI identified the location of the text message, John was already 2 states away. He had learned from his mistake. The prepaid phone was discarded, probably smashed, dumped in a trash bin, or tossed out of a moving vehicle somewhere along the highway. Still, he was getting desperate. He wouldn't have reached out unless he needed something. That meant he was running out of options. The FBI turned their attention to the recipient of the message, the old Army acquaintance in California. They brought him in for questioning, pressing him for any details about John's potential whereabouts. The man insisted he hadn't responded, said he hadn't spoken to John in years, said he had no idea where he was. But investigators weren't convinced. They had seen this before. People reluctant to turn in an old friend, hesitant to betray someone they once trusted. So they pushed harder. What had John said the last time they spoke? Where had he mentioned wanting to go? Had he ever talked about disappearing? The man finally cracked. He admitted that John had once talked about going off the grid if things ever got bad, heading somewhere remote, somewhere with people who didn't ask questions. John had connections in the survivalist community. That changed everything. Authorities expanded their search, focusing on rural compounds, isolated communities, and off-the-grid settlements across Arizona, Nevada, and California. They cross-checked John's known past associates, looking for anyone who had dropped off the map in recent years, anyone who might offer him shelter. Then they got their biggest break yet. A stolen vehicle was reported abandoned near a remote desert area outside Bakersfield, California. The vehicle matched the description of a car seen on surveillance footage at the last known motel where John had stayed. Inside the car, police found discarded fast food wrappers, empty water bottles, and, most chillingly, a half-burned map with highlighted routes leading deeper into the desert. He was hiding somewhere out there. This was their chance. Authorities immediately launched a ground search, deploying helicopters, drones, and K-9 units to comb through the area. For the first time since the manhunt had begun, the odds were no longer in John's favor. He was trapped, and they were closing in. The desert was vast, stretching for miles in every direction, a landscape of endless dust and silence. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, where the land swallowed secrets whole, where the only company was the unforgiving heat and the howl of the wind. And somewhere out there, John Blauvelt was hiding. Authorities had the stolen car. They had the burned map. They had an approximate location. But finding him would not be easy. The terrain was brutal, scattered with dry riverbeds, abandoned mining shafts, and isolated cabins where drifters sometimes stayed. This wasn't just a manhunt anymore. It was a race against time. If John slipped deeper into the desert, he could be lost for weeks, months, even years. He had survived in harsh conditions before. His military training meant he knew how to ration supplies, avoid detection, and navigate terrain most people would consider impossible. He wasn't going to make this easy. The FBI, local law enforcement, and U.S. Marshals assembled at a makeshift command post just outside the area where the stolen car had been found. Helicopters patrolled overhead, scanning the ground with thermal imaging. Officers on foot and ATVs pushed forward, combing through every abandoned structure, every crevice, every potential hiding spot. And then they found something. Less than 2 miles from the abandoned car, in a dry, rocky clearing, search teams discovered a makeshift campsite. The fire was cold, the ashes scattered, but the signs were unmistakable. Someone had been staying there recently. There were discarded food wrappers, an empty water bottle, and, most disturbingly, boot prints leading away from the site. The tread pattern matched military-issued boots. It was him. John was still out here. But where was Hannah? That was the question that weighed heaviest on investigators' minds. Was she still with him? Had she run? Had something worse happened? The tracks led toward a canyon where jagged cliffs and narrow passes created natural blind spots, perfect for someone trying to evade capture. Officers slowed their approach, moving carefully, scanning the ridges for any sign of movement. Then a noise, a sharp crack, the sound of loose rock breaking free and tumbling down a slope. Someone was up there. The team froze, listening. The radios went silent. Helicopters held their positions overhead, waiting. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every breath feel heavier. Then a flash of movement. A figure darted between the rocks, scrambling for higher ground. There! The officers took off, racing up the uneven terrain, closing in. John had seen them. He knew they were coming, but he wasn't surrendering. He was running again. He moved fast, cutting through the canyon, disappearing behind a ridge, kicking up clouds of dust as he went. The chase was brutal, the heat pressing down, the loose earth shifting underfoot, the exhaustion setting in. And then suddenly, a second figure appeared. Hannah. She wasn't running with him. She was alone, standing frozen near an outcrop, staring down at the officers. Her face was pale, her clothes were dirty, and there was something in her eyes that looked like relief. One of the agents called out to her. She hesitated, then took a step forward. John stopped. He turned, looking back at her, realizing what was happening. She wasn't going with him, not this time, and for the first time since his escape, he lost control. He shouted, something unintelligible, something desperate. He moved toward her, but she flinched, stepping back. That hesitation was all law enforcement needed. Officers swarmed, closing the gap, surrounding him before he could make another move. There was nowhere left to go. He was cornered. The standoff lasted seconds but felt longer. John breathing heavily, eyes darting between the officers and Hannah, as if calculating whether he could still find a way out. Then he dropped to his knees, his hands slowly lifted into the air. It was over. John Blauvelt, the fugitive who had evaded capture for years, was finally in custody. Hannah was safe, and Kati Blauvelt's murder would finally get the justice it deserved. The chase was over. John Blauvelt, the man who had spent years evading capture, was now in custody, shackled in handcuffs, his once meticulous plan for freedom reduced to nothing. His arrest had been swift in the end, a final, desperate sprint into the desert before reality caught up with him. Now he was behind bars, awaiting the trial that would determine his fate. But justice was not instant. It was slow. It was painful. And for Caddy's family, it had been far too long in the making. The case had now moved from the realm of manhunt and capture into the judicial system, where facts would be examined, evidence would be presented, and the final truth about what really happened to Caddy Blauvelt would be laid bare for all to see. The prosecution was relentless. From the moment the trial began, they painted a chilling picture of John's jealousy, possessiveness, and calculated cruelty. They detailed how his obsession with control over Caddy had continued long after their separation, how his resentment had boiled beneath the surface, manifesting in stalking, harassment, and threats. Caddy had tried to move on. She had sought safety, distance, a new life. John had refused to let that happen. The evidence against him was overwhelming. First, there was the restraining order, a crucial piece of the puzzle that proved Caddy had feared for her safety long before her murder. It detailed past incidents of harassment, incidents that now seemed like warnings ignored. Then the cell phone records, which showed that John had been near Caddy's home on the night of her disappearance. Next, the security footage, grainy but damning, capturing his car in the vicinity of the abandoned house where Caddy's body had been found. But the most haunting piece of evidence came from Hannah Thompson. She had spent years in hiding with John, years believing his lies, running from the law, trapped in a world of fear and manipulation. But now, freed from his control, she was ready to tell the truth. Her testimony was devastating. She described the night Caddy disappeared, how John had come to her, agitated, anxious, muttering things she didn't understand at the time, how he had insisted they needed to leave immediately. No time for questions, no time for second thoughts. She had asked him again and again what happened. He had refused to answer. But over time, through half-whispered confessions and slips of the tongue, the truth had leaked out. John had lured Caddy to that abandoned house. He had waited for her, and then he had killed her. The forensic evidence supported her account. The angle of the wounds, the lack of defensive injuries. Caddy had likely been ambushed, caught off guard, unable to fight back. John's defense tried to discredit Hannah, calling her a manipulated witness, suggesting she was simply saying what the prosecution wanted her to say. But the evidence was too strong. And then came the moment that silenced the entire courtroom. A recording. A voice memo found buried in the data of an old discarded phone, one that had once belonged to Caddy. It was a message she had recorded just days before her death. Her voice was quiet, shaky. "I feel like I'm being watched, like he's still out there. I don't know if I'm just paranoid, but if anything happens to me, tell them to look at him." The jury didn't take long to deliberate. When the verdict was read, Caddy's family sat in the front row, gripping each other's hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. Guilty. The courtroom was silent at first. Then came the gasps, the quiet sobs, the weight of justice finally delivered. John Blauvelt was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Caddy's family, it wasn't enough to bring her back. Nothing ever would be. But at least now, after years of pain, they could close the book on the man who had taken her away. Justice had been served, but the scars he left behind would never fully heal. Justice had been served, but justice was never the same as closure. For Caddy Blauvelt's family, the verdict brought a sense of relief, but it did not erase the pain. It did not bring her back. The empty chair at the dinner table remained. The phone calls that would never come still haunted them. They had fought for this moment, for the truth to be laid bare in a courtroom, for John Blauvelt to face the consequences of what he had done. But what came next? The news cycle moved on. The headlines that once screamed, "Fugitive captured after years on the run," faded into archived articles. The reporters packed up, and the world shifted its focus to the next crime, the next tragedy. But for those left behind, the wounds remained. Caddy's parents struggled to rebuild their lives. They had spent years consumed by grief, fighting for justice, advocating for their daughter when she no longer had a voice. Now they faced the impossible task of learning how to live again, without her. Her mother spoke at events about domestic violence awareness, warning others about the signs of manipulation and control, hoping that maybe, just maybe, another young woman might hear her story and escape before it was too late. Her father didn't speak as much. He visited Caddy's grave often, sitting there for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just staring at the headstone in silence. And then there was Hannah Thompson, the girl who had spent years on the run, caught in the web of a murderer's lies. The girl who had once believed in John, who had trusted him, who had followed him into the unknown, only to learn too late that she was nothing more than another pawn in his game. Hannah was free now, but freedom was complicated. She had spent so long running, looking over her shoulder, waiting for the inevitable day when everything would catch up with them. Now that it had, she had to face the truth. She had been used. She had been manipulated. She had been groomed. And she had been lucky to get out alive. The public had mixed opinions about her. Some saw her as a victim, a teenager lured into a dangerous situation by a man who controlled her every move. Others saw her as complicit, a girl who had stayed with a fugitive even when she knew what he had done. She carried the weight of those judgments everywhere she went. She had to rebuild her life from nothing. She went into therapy, trying to untangle the years of psychological abuse she had endured, trying to reclaim the person she had been before John Blauvelt entered her world. It wasn't easy. There were nightmares. There were days when she couldn't get out of bed, when the past felt too heavy, when she wondered if she would ever truly be free of him. But she kept going. She had survived. And in time, she learned to stop blaming herself for believing the wrong person. As for John Blauvelt, he rotted in a prison cell, the life he had once controlled reduced to nothing more than a daily routine behind concrete walls. He had spent years evading justice, thinking he was untouchable, believing that he could outrun the past. But in the end, it had caught up to him. And there, in the silence of his cell, he had nothing left but time. Time to think about what he had done. Time to remember the life he had stolen, the people he had destroyed, and the truth he could no longer escape.